Hey guys, it's Justin, back today to talk about Super Mario RPG, and specifically, what's going on with that Metacritic score. At the time of recording, Super Mario RPG, the remake, has a Metacritic score of 83. That's out of more than 80 critic reviews. Now, out of all those reviews, there are 0 negative reviews, but a few mixed reviews kind of pull the score down a lot. Now let's think about that, an 83. It's not bad, right? It's not great either. The thing is, whenever Nintendo releases a mainline Mario game, and yeah, I'll consider this a mainline Mario game, we expect something more than just average. Whenever Nintendo puts out a Mario game, it scores pretty high. So this one stands out a little. So is the game really just average, or is something else going on here? It might just be that, clinically speaking, this is a weird little game. Before we go any further, let's just get this out of the way. The Metacritic score should not impact your enjoyment of the game. It's this arbitrary number that's an average of a bunch of other arbitrary numbers. There can be a game that scored, I don't know, in the 50s, and if you really love it, that's good for you. But it gives us something to talk about. So here we are. Partly because of its quality, partly because of nostalgia, the original Super Mario RPG is often mentioned as one of the best RPGs ever made. After all, it was released during the 16-bit RPG heyday right alongside Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, Final Fantasy VI. At the time, Nintendo and Square were taking a huge risk. It was 1996 and Mario had never been on an adventure like this. Before Super Mario RPG, Super Mario was a platformer. He stomped Goombas, collected power-ups, jumped to the top of flagpoles, didn't engage in turn-based combat. Obviously, Square had a ton of success with the Final Fantasy series, especially in Japan, but the genre was still more niche in the West. Mario's familiar face was just what Square needed to try to bring RPGs to a much wider audience, especially in the West. Apparently, at the same time, Miyamoto also wanted to see Mario in an RPG, so the timing was perfect. Hey, really quick, if you like this video, please consider subscribing. It means a lot to me and it helps the channel grow. Right now we're sitting at like 988 subscribers. It'd be awesome to hit 1,000 with this video. But anyway, no pressure. Let's get back to it. Just looking at the game, the isometric perspective made it unlike anything we had ever seen Mario in. But it also made it different from all of other Square's RPGs. The game took advantage of the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 graphics, which allowed for some pseudo 3D rendering, which would have been super impressive at the time if the Nintendo 64 and Mario 64 wouldn't have released just a few months later. Despite releasing basically alongside the Nintendo 64, Super Mario RPG went on to be the 6th best-selling game that year. So the game sold relatively well back in 1996. But I think for a lot of people, we were already thinking about the Nintendo 64 and we weren't buying new games for the Super Nintendo. It was just one of those late releases that kind of passed a lot of people by. So a lot of us missed it. I personally didn't know anybody who owned Super Mario RPG. I remember renting it a few times, but I didn't know anybody who actually had a copy of it. I didn't own a copy until many years later. So for me, the coolest thing about this remake is making it accessible again. Putting it into the hands of people who may have missed it in 1996 or weren't even born in 1996. Nintendo has released the game a few times digitally, but we haven't seen a physical copy since 1996. A digital copy was available on the Wii and on the Wii U Virtual Console, and the game was included on the Super Nintendo Classic. But if you don't have a Wii, a Wii U, or a Super Nintendo Classic, you're out of luck. At least if you want to play on Nintendo hardware. One of the things that surprises me the most is Nintendo hasn't even made Super Mario RPG available on the Nintendo Switch Online. Now with the release of the remaster, maybe that's because they wanted you to spend $60 on this, especially since this is basically the same game. But anyway, since the original release in 1996, Nintendo hasn't made another physical copy of this game. If you wanted the original, before the pandemic, you could find a loose copy for around $40. But since 2020, the prices have spiked, much like everything else. Now, it'll cost you closer to $90. And if you want it complete in box, it'll run you around $300. But now, Nintendo has repackaged the game, making it more available, accessible, and approachable than ever. It's nearly a one-to-one recreation of the original, and for a lot of reviewers, that was a sticking point. That dropped the Metascore a lot. The reviewers who gave it a 70, A lot of what they were talking about was how close it was to the original and how it wasn't taking any risks. It wasn't adding anything new. And I get it, they were looking for a little more. But in this remake, the combat is basically the same. There's not much new story stuff outside of some post-game content, and there aren't any new minigames. I hear you, and I get it. But for me, that's how I like it. That's how I wanted this game. All I wanted was to own and be able to play this game physically again. It's been hard to play this game for a while now, and this remaster, with its new coat of paint, gives that opportunity to new players who weren't around for the Super Nintendo. That's huge, that's awesome, that's a success for me. Another thing reviewers said about the game was that it was a little too easy, which I totally get. The original was pretty easy too. But the thing is, that makes this game a gateway into other RPGs, especially turn-based RPGs that aren't getting a lot of love right now. That's exactly what Square wanted. It doesn't have huge difficulty spikes, there's no need to grind, you don't have to spend 40 hours following this convoluted story about killing a god. It gives you the experience you need to get acquainted with typical RPG mechanics without bogging you down. It was the same for me back in the mid to late 90s with another RPG that was a little too easy, Pokemon Blue. But it's because of Pokemon Blue that I learned to love turn-based RPGs. And I think Super Mario RPG can be that for an entirely new generation. So anyway, does Super Mario RPG show its age? Yeah, it does, absolutely. But do we really want Nintendo to mess around with a classic like this? For me, no way. For me, Super Mario RPG is more like the Link's Awakening remake than anything else. The Link's Awakening remake was basically a one-to-one recreation, and it scored an 87 on Metacritic, just saying. And the aesthetic was a little different, maybe that played into it, but ultimately these are sort of like sibling games. Remakes of classics that are true remakes. But if you don't like it, I totally get it. The new remaster might be a little too cartoony for you. It's not as dark as the original, and I completely agree. But just like Final Fantasy VII, the original is always there, you know? You can always go back and play it. Well, as long as you're willing to pay. So what did you guys think of Super Mario RPG? Is this the kind of thing you want Nintendo to continue to do? Should they just not touch classics at all? Or should they be offering this plus more? Should this have been much more than just a one-to-one remake? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing.
Oh yeah.